I'm really honored to have been invited to come and speak with all of you and to share a little bit about my work, which I'm passionate about. So I'm just gonna take a second and start sharing my screen. So give me one moment. Okay, can everyone see Oceans of Hope? Okay, perfect. Uh, Thank you again for having me. So what I'm sharing today is a search for ocean solutions and community plans, and as well as the importance of our food systems in terms of ocean conservation and tackling the challenges that we're currently facing today around our world. So as Don kindly mentioned, my name is Rosie Poirier. I'm a diver and marine scientist, artist, underwater photographer, and filmmaker. I spend a lot of time in the underwater world, both diving and on boats. This is just some of the credentials that I have in terms of my field of work. I have done a lot of field work working with different species and different ecotypes. I've spent quite a bit of time working with sharks in the Bahamas, doing tagging, population studies. I spent 4 years working with whales on the west coast of Canada off of Vancouver Island. And I have more recently been starting to work in kelp forest ecosystems and looking at the dynamics and population of kelp forests. So I'll be able to share a little bit more in depth about some of these projects as I continue. So the work that I do works at the intersection of management, science, storytelling, and culture in order to resolve some of the challenges that we're facing today. So all of these are important priorities because you need management and policy in order to protect ecosystems. We need science in order to understand the ecosystems that we're working with. Storytelling is very key because it allows to build capacity, to share information, to inspire and galvanize action. And then of course, culture, because at the core of our identities are our culture and the way that we interact with the world around us. So I'm going to focus primarily on the intersection of humans and the oceans in this presentation. So first I wanted to touch on how we rely on the ocean. We rely on the ocean for many key services, and this includes provisioning. That typically falls under three categories, with the first one being the easiest to define. With provisioning, as that is the way that we are utilizing resources from the ocean, including food and transportation, minerals, fuel. This is the one that's the easiest to calculate. Then we have regulating services, which is a little bit harder to calculate. This is the way that the ocean is balancing the world as we know it. So providing oxygen, regulating our weather patterns, providing storm barriers. And then we have cultural services, which is the most abstract. And this is the way that we're interacting with the oceans, the way that we learn and play, the way that it defines who we are as people. But despite the fact that we rely on the oceans for our survival, the oceans are in peril and they're facing many, many challenges as a result of the ways that we are interacting. So some of these challenges are overfishing from increased demand and poor fishing practices that are destroying the very fisheries that we rely on. Then there's pollution. This is both physical pollution in the form of plastics and ghost nets and more. And it's also chemical pollution, which is much more challenging to tackle. And then we have climate change and ocean acidification, where the oceans are absorbing a lot of the carbon from our atmosphere. It's changing the chemistry of the oceans and is affecting the ecosystems that need to exist within a very narrow chemical range. So, and then we have habitat destruction, and this is from coastal development as well as from fisheries that are destroying habitats. So there are a lot of challenges that we're facing today. So I'm going to start off by sharing a little bit about some of the work that I've done and the process that has led me to where I am and the work that I do now today. So as I mentioned, I spent 4 years working in whale conservation in the Pacific Northwest. And during this time, I focused primarily on one ecotype of orca. So not even orcas as a whole, particularly on one ecotype of orca called the southern resident killer whales. And they have been critically endangered for many years. Southern residents have a challenging history in terms of their interactions with humans. So just to give a brief overview, indigenous communities off the Pacific Northwest had long had a very positive relationship with the orcas. They saw them as kin, and they had a lot of respect for them. When colonizers arrived and began to establish, the orcas were seen very differently in their eyes. They saw them as competition, they saw them as a nuisance, they saw them as dangerous. And for many years, they tried to eradicate orcas, and they would shoot them. They would try and kill them when they would see them. And this is not even that long ago. This was up until the mid-60s, where it was very common to see bullet marks in the sides of the orcas. And many of them were killed just due to misunderstanding. And this didn't stop until around 1967, around 1967, when the Vancouver Aquarium was determined to create a replica of an orca. And so they sent out 2 people to shoot an orca, bring it back dead so that they could create a very realistic replica of one. But when they shot the orca, it didn't die. And the 2 who were given the job of killing the orca didn't have the heart to kill it. So they dragged it back to Vancouver from the Gulf Islands. And there, that whale remained in the marina for 3 months. And the aquarium decided to keep it to see if they could feed it. And what they found was a huge amount of curiosity from onlookers. Plenty of people were coming to come and visit this whale, and this triggered the whale trade that is still continuing to this day. So now this population of southern residents that had been shot and killed previously was no longer being targeted in that way, but they were now being targeted for the whale trade. So now you have boats that were targeting them and removing the mothers and the young, who are they're the biological capital of that community. They are the reproductive capital of that community. So they were targeting the very whales that allowed that population to continue to exist. And so that happened for over 5 years, and there was more than 50 whales that were removed from that population and shipped around the world, and many more whales that were unaccounted for that died during the process of capture. And so that was very unfortunate, and it didn't end until a researcher named Michael Biggs started to do a population assessment of the community. And he developed what is now used all around the world, which is the photo ID technique, where you use the dorsal fin on the saddle patch of the whales to determine their individual IDs. And for a long time, people thought that there were thousands and thousands of orcas. But what Michael Biggs was able to prove was that their populations were actually quite small, and that they travel very long distances, but that the populations themselves are not that large. And this triggered the protection of the whales. So the aquarium trade was stopped in Canada. Whales were no longer shot, they were no longer being removed for the aquarium trade, and they are now under very heavy protection. The aquarium trade did continue for much longer in other parts of the world, and in some areas it is still happening today. But in Canada, this was stopped in the mid-70s. So this is to show a population trend of the southern resident killer whales since that time. So you can see in the beginning, this is 1975, there were 72 whales. Now, after 50 years of protection, we've seen a slight rise with a peak in 1995, and then a rapid decline, a little bit of rise, and now declining. So today the population sits at 73. This graph ends in 2019, but the current population is still 73. So imagine, after 50 years of protection, they're strictly protected, can't be killed, can't be removed for aquarium, aren't being targeted in those ways. We still are now at nearly the same population as we were 50 years prior. So that's very interesting. And you wonder, okay, they've been protected, why are we still not seeing an increase? And there are many factors at play, many things that are currently affecting this population. This can be anything from noise pollution from boats to physical disturbances from boats. There's a very active whale watch community here, and at times it can be stressful for the whales. There's also a lot of pollution, both physical and chemical, as I was mentioning. The chemical pollution in particular is affecting them. So they live in a very industrial area. And this is This is affecting their ability to carry their young to term. So often they die before they're born, or they aren't able to survive past the first year of their life due to the heavy concentration of toxins. But one of the biggest things is their food source. So maybe they would be able to deal with one or two of these stressors, but when you compile multiple stressors all at once, they aren't able to recover. So if we look at a similar graph of their food source, which southern resident orcas, all orca ecotypes have different food sources, but southern residents eat primarily Chinook salmon. So if we're to look at a graph of Chinook salmon abundance over this same period of time, then you start to see a lot of similarities in terms of the graphs. So this one starts in 1980. You can see a slight rise, which you're seeing here, another rise, and then a rapid drop. This graph ends in 2015, but there has been a continued decline since this time. And you can see that same decline reflected in the population of the orcas. So we can have these measures that are protecting the orcas from our what we see as direct human interactions, which is we're no longer killing them, we're no longer removing them. But if we're not looking at protecting their food source, then we can't effectively conserve and protect these orca. So that's where I want to bring in the importance of food systems, looking at our own food systems, as well as the food systems of the species that we're trying to protect. So orcas they're an indicator species because they indicate the overall health of an ecosystem. Because if you don't have the apex predator and the apex predator is decline, you know that the health of the remainder of the ecosystem is also imbalance and under threat, because the top of the food chain is showing and indicating the state of the rest of the food chain. So just to give another similar example, this is about white sharks off of South Africa. So there's a huge amount of white shark tourism in South Africa that have been happening for many, many years. And this was a very popular location for people to go and see white sharks up close firsthand, both through cage diving or going out and watching them on boats, because in South Africa was one of the only locations in the world where you can see white sharks breaching. And they breach because one of their prey sources, the fur seal, are very hard to catch. And so they come and ambush them from below, they breach out of the water, and they surprise the fur seal. And so this became a very popular place to go and see white sharks in these two different settings, both underwater and on the water. And the tourism industry here was thriving. And recently it has been almost completely terminated due to a reduction of white shark population off of South Africa. So they used to have this really healthy population, and very rapidly they were completely gone over a matter of years. And now there aren't enough white sharks to maintain the tourism there. And for a long time, the conversation revolved around orca, because there was an ecotype of orca that were seen in this area that are known to hunt sharks. So there are certain types of orcas that hunt sharks, and they would target the great whites, and they eat the liver from the great whites as it has high nutrients. And there were some bodies of white sharks that were seen washed up that had been very clearly eaten. But it was very easy to use the orca as a scapegoat, because you go, oh, it's the orca's fault that there are no white sharks. But again, apex predators are an indication of the rest of the ecosystem. And when scientists were diving deeper, they discovered that the lack of renewed restrictions of fishing regulations were causing collapse of one of the great white sharks' prey sources, which is the smoothhound and soupfin shark, and that there were hugely unsustainable harvest rates from 2016 to 2019. So again, it's tracked back to the food system and the food sources. So it's really important for us to look at our ocean environments in a holistic manner and to understand the food system dynamics between predator and prey, and also our own, because we rely on the oceans heavily for our own sources of protein. Fish provides the primary source of protein to more than 2 billion people around the world. And so we are heavily reliant on the ocean and the well-being of the oceans for our future as well. So food systems represent interspecies interactions, and interspecies interactions are the basis of an ecosystem. And food production is a major driver of climate change and destruction of nature. It accounts for nearly 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, 40% of land use, and 70% of water use globally. So our food systems define a lot of our interactions with our ecosystems. So I'm going to share now a few different projects that I had the honor of working on that are integrating conservation and food systems. And these are projects, a few different examples from around the world that I found very encouraging in my search for ocean solutions and trying to find effective conservation strategies. And each of them look different. Some of them are not directly what people would define as conservation. So I spent 2 weeks aboard a commercial halibut fishing boat in Canada last summer with a fishing family that I have a great deal of respect for, and they taught me a lot about the ground fisheries management in Canada. And they worked in particular with halibut and had held a license for halibut. And they taught me about the implementation of a quota share management that was established in Canada. So one of the huge problems with fisheries is bycatch and the waste from the fisheries industry, especially with certain more destructive fishing practices such as trawling, bottom trawling, where the ocean floor is scraped via net and everything off the bottom is brought up in the net in order to harvest target species. For example, some kind of bottom dwelling fish, even something like halibut, could be targeted in this way because they're bottom dwellers. So you scrape the ocean floor, you remove your target species, and the rest is wasted. So these are very destructive and wasteful forms of fishing. But what they were doing was much more targeted, and they told me about the quota share management that was for the purpose of reducing bycatch. Because bycatch is unfortunately inevitable in fishing. It's very hard to target just one species of fish and only that species. And so a lot of even smaller scale artisanal fisheries were pulling up other types of fish that they had to then throw back. And when you throw back that fish, not all of them are going to survive. There's a mortality rate that has been studied for every species of fish. And some of them have mortalities up to 40% or more. And some of them have low mortality rates for being thrown back into the ocean, around 8%. But either way, as we're pulling up bycatch and we're throwing it back, there's always going to be a mortality rate. So if everyone's catching each other's fish in bycatch and throwing it back, then we have a very inefficient food system in terms of our fisheries management. So what they did now, instead, when you're allocated a license for a certain species, for example, given a halibut license, before, when you had a halibut license, you were only allowed to catch halibut. Anything else had to be returned. Now, under a halibut license, you're also given a certain amount of allocation towards other species of fish that you're likely going to catch when targeting halibut. So when the quota is determined for the year for any specific fisheries, and now instead of just allocating that quota to license holders, a certain percent of that quota goes to license holders, and another percent of that quota is allocated towards those with other licenses who are allowed to catch a certain percent of a fish in their bycatch. So now, with their halibut fishing license, they're allowed a certain amount of halibut and then a certain amount of black cod, which they're also likely to catch, a certain amount of rockfish that they're likely to catch, a certain amount of lingcod, different species. And so this means that it's reducing the bycatch and recognizing the fact that fisheries has a challenge to target just one fish, and integrating that into the management system. But it doesn't mean that it's just a free-for-all that you can fish anywhere, because you still have a limit to how much bycatch you can get. And so it creates almost these de facto marine protected areas. They're not actual marine protected areas because they're not being managed like a marine protected area, but it means that if there's a certain zone where you're likely to catch a lot of rockfish, and you're only allowed a certain quota for rockfish as bycatch, then you can only fish there a little bit, or you have to avoid that spot completely and go to somewhere where you're not going to be pulling up rockfish as bycatch. So it's creating, through fisheries management, it's protecting certain areas just via the fisheries regulations and laws that fishermen are under in terms of their fishing quota. So this was a really interesting take at management, because through fisheries management, we're ensuring that we have a food system that is secure for the future, and we can also protect our ecosystems by managing the way that we are catching our fish. Now, another project that I had the chance to work on was with the Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, where they're looking into tools for aquaculture management and fisheries science. And they're targeting specific questions in their research and looking at ways to reduce the impact of fisheries and aquaculture and to create shifts in the market that will reduce the carbon footprint of a specific fisheries. So one of the projects that they were working on was with the prickleback and the unagi market. So freshwater eel is very popular on the sushi market. But unfortunately, freshwater eel are carnivorous and they are very resource intensive to raise, as any carnivorous fish is going to have a higher carbon footprint than herbivorous fish. And so one of the projects that they were looking at was raising pricklebacks instead of freshwater eels, because pricklebacks are herbivorous and have a much lower carbon footprint, and when cooked have a very similar taste and texture to unagi. So if they were able to successfully raise the entire life cycle of prickleback in an aquaculture system, then this is something that could be expanded and will shift one of our popular fishery species to a herbivorous one and greatly reduce the impact of that market. So I got to spend time working with their seaweed cultures as well. And seaweed is a fantastic carbon sink as well for growing, and seaweeds grow very fast, different algae that they were growing and selling to different markets. And so these were just one of the many projects that they were working on. But it was fascinating because they were combining conservation with food systems and studying very specific research questions relating to food systems. And another interesting project that I got to spend time with was at the Cayman Turtle Center, where they were also combining food systems and conservation. And I think a lot of the time we see certain species as acceptable to eat and others as not, but different cultures all have different food systems, and it's important to respect the variety of cultures and interactions around the world. So for me, I would always look at a sea turtle and see that as not a source of food, but that's not the case for everyone in the world. So in Cayman, it's traditional to eat sea turtle, and there's nothing wrong with eating sea turtle, but it only becomes a challenge with a growing population and when sea turtles are subjected to other pressures from that are declining their population. And so the sea turtle population around the Cayman Islands was greatly diminishing. And the government decided to put a stop to wild harvest of sea turtles because they were seeing a huge decline in sea turtle population around their islands. And this was not necessarily just due to the fact that islanders were harvesting them for food, but due to a lot of the other stressors that sea turtles are facing globally in terms of habitat loss, no longer having quiet beaches to be able to go and nest on, and other being caught in bycatch and other pressures. But Cayman put a stop on wild harvest, but instead of completely restricting the ability to eat sea turtle, they established a sea turtle farm. Because often when you put a blanket ban on something and the community is not on board, what results is poaching. And recognizing that as being a challenge, they established a sea turtle farm. And so they harvested a certain amount of sea turtles from the wild and then bred them on land on their sea turtle farm, where they had an artificial beach set up where the sea turtles could go on that beach and nest. And it became a very effective system where the sea turtles, they have about, at this point, they have a population over 200 that is a breeding population on the farm. And they go on the artificial beach and they nest. And then a certain amount of those eggs are raised for turtle meat. And then a certain amount of those eggs are reintroduced into the ecosystem. So some of them they take and rebury onto a local beach. And then some of them they raise and hatch in their laboratory and then release them once they're hatched. And then a certain number of them they raise what they call like an early jump start, where they raise them for about a year or two on the farm and then release them. So they're doing 3 different techniques to see if one is more efficient than the other in terms of seeing a higher rate of survival, because with sea turtles, their hatchlings often only have 1 in 100 that survive. And this is due to the fact that they're small, they're very edible, they're very vulnerable, they have soft shells initially, and are often targeted as a prey source by other species. So they're doing these 3 different systems, and then they are tracking the results using DNA. When sea turtles return to nest on the beach and they're laying eggs, they take a blood sample and then they process that and they look at their DNA. And what they were able to see was this huge population boost, and that 90% of turtles returning to nest on the Grand Cayman were from the farm breed stock. And so they were seeing this huge success story in terms of a population boost of the sea turtles, and they're returning to nest on the same beaches that they had left from. So this was hugely successful. It tackled both a food systems issue, where sea turtle is part of the local culture as a food source, and also tackled a conservation issue with a decline of sea turtles, and very effectively did that, very gracefully did that. And despite that, it's still something that receives a lot of scrutiny and criticism, simply because many people around the world don't view sea turtle as a source of food and think that this is cruel. But just to put it within context, all around the world, we have different ways of harvesting from our environment. We have different species that we see as acceptable, and it's not no one's job to say that one or the other is acceptable, but instead to look at it from the dynamic of, is it sustainable? So the way that it was being harvested before was not sustainable, but they were able to find a way that worked, that respected local culture and ensured that the population can continue to grow for the future. Because at the end of the day, our food systems should be regenerative and not just be taking. So another story from a different region of the world is around marine protected area networks in the Coral Triangle region. And the Coral Triangle is a very biodiverse region of the Pacific, and it comprises of 6 nations: Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste, and I can't see it, the last one in this slide, unfortunately, my title is over it. But it's 6 nations where we are seeing the most biodiversity in the Pacific Ocean. And so this is a really key area in terms of protecting biodiversity, nursery grounds, sanctuaries. So there are a lot of projects in the Coral Triangle region for conservation, but there are also a lot of fisheries in the Coral Triangle region. And some of those are artisanal fisheries, meaning that these fishing communities rely on their ability to fish to support their families. And one mistake with marine protected areas is to put one in place without consulting the local community. And then you have pushback. And if there's not enforcement, then the laws of the marine protected area are not respected. And it ends up being something that we call a paper park, where it's put in place on paper. It looks like a great initiative, but then in reality, it's not being implemented. There was no consultation. The locals are not in agreement of it. So it's really important to have marine protected area networks that have gone through the process of consultation and are established with some form of agreement with locals who rely on that space, and to ignore the fact that we rely on the oceans for resources and food, and to just blindly protect an area without some form of consultation or recognition of the ecosystem, both human and nature, that already exists there, is not a very effective way to protect. So one of the organizations I had the chance to work with is Coastal Conservation and Education Foundation, or CCEF. And they have been establishing and maintaining MPAs through intensive community consultation. And they work with the local fishing communities in this area, and they consult with them. And initially, there was a lot of pushback. The fishing community was very wary of them, because when they hear conservation, they associate that with loss of jobs, loss of security, loss of food source. But CCEF was really determined to work with the local community. So they were consulting with the fishermen. They spent years developing these relationships, and then they established protected areas and networks, management networks, that were working with the local fishermen. And then what they saw instead after this whole process of conservation, the fishermen who were wary initially were instead seeing that these management systems were increasing the number of fish that they were now catching. It was boosting the ecosystem, increasing the fish stocks, and now they were in huge support of it. And they have a really good relationship with the fishing community. They still go 3 times a year and do consultations and check-ins, and are in constant communication with the fishing community. And they've had this concentrated on one island and are trying to expand these projects to other islands because of the success. And not only that, but they are also training locals to monitor and conduct the science for monitoring the reefs and monitoring the marine protected areas. So this is building capacity. These are a couple different techniques for monitoring. One is an image-based photo quadrat that uses computer technology to assess the benthic area of the reef, and then you have point intercept transect, where a trained individual goes and conducts the survey. But through capacity building, collaborating with locals, then you're reducing the amount of resources that need to be expended, and not having to transport someone in to do this research, but you're training resources locally. So these are some really effective techniques for managing protected areas and managing fisheries and ensuring that food source is still available. So one last project that I'm going to share about is the kelp forests and community management of Baja California. And this is another example of local management and food systems management that have protected a key ecosystem. So one of the challenges for kelp forest environments off the Pacific coast is a proliferation of urchins. And urchins eat kelp, and they're an important ecosystem component, but when there are too many urchins and there's not enough predators of urchins, then they will overgraze a kelp forest to the ground. So kelp is one of the fastest growing, it is the fastest growing plant in the world. It can grow up to a foot a day and creates these amazing 3D structures for fish and invertebrates to live within. They are an ecosystem builder. They are a nutrient source. They are an amazing carbon sink. Kelp are really critical to temperate environments. And unfortunately, due to ecosystem imbalance, a lot of kelp forests are in peril. And off of California, certain areas have even lost up to 98% of their kelp cover. And in Baja, it's up to 80%. And this is due to changes in climate, changing water temperatures, as kelp do require temperate waters in order to grow, but it's also due to this major problem around urchins. And so this is an image where you can see a bunch of urchins grazing a piece of kelp. This was taken just off of Vancouver Island, a place called Race Rocks. And the result of urchins overgrazing is something that we call urchin barrens. And this is where you see almost nothing but urchins. And urchins can live in this almost like zombie state. So even if they've overgrazed an environment, they can then reduce their internal components and live in a dormant stage. And that means that it's very, very hard for an ecosystem to recover once it's become an urchin barren, because the urchins don't die out once the food source is gone. They go into a dormant stage. So now if even a small piece of kelp starts to seed itself here and grow, the urchins will immediately start to graze it because they are still there in this environment. So urchin barrens are a huge challenge, and there are a lot of urchin predators that can be managed in order to manage the urchin barrens, but there's one in particular that people have focused on. So these are just some examples of urchin predators. There's the sunflower star, the sheep's head, the wolf eel, lobsters eat urchins, many other species eat urchins, but we like to hyper focus on sea otters. And maybe people have already heard of this ecosystem dynamic, but sea otters eat urchins, and sea otters in the Pacific Northwest were heavily hunted for the fur trade. And so their populations are still recovering. In certain areas, they have not recovered at all. For example, in northern Vancouver Island, we have 2 resident sea otters. In southern Vancouver Island. In the north, there are more, but in the south, this population has never recovered. So again, similar with the orca, off of South Africa, where people love to have a scapegoat, something to blame, wanting to point the finger at the orca instead of recognizing our own impact. They say, oh, well, sea otters were fished out, like 100 years ago in the early 1900s. And now, because their populations have not bounced back, the urchins are taking over. And yes, it's true. Without the sea otters, there is one less predator of the urchins, but sea otters are not the only predator. And so saying that it's all having to do with sea otters is putting the problem in the past, because we're saying that happened in the past. Sea otters were over harvested for the fur trade so many years ago. We would never do that now. The fur trade is abolished. But our actions today are actually influencing these ecosystems, because the urchins have a lot of other predators that we are currently overfishing and not maintaining the environment to ensure that there's a healthy ecosystem dynamic here. So in Baja California, there are a lot of fishing communities and fishing cooperatives. And the areas that have the healthiest kelp forests are the areas where the fishing cooperatives are managing the fisheries there. So it's not necessarily marine protected areas, it's just zones of fisheries management. And these fishing cooperatives are families that have ancestral roots to that land and are given fishing permits and fishing rights over generations. And because they have that generational connection, that generational security and a type of ownership over the fisheries, they go to great lengths in order to manage their fisheries. And there are some local nonprofits that have been working with them. One in particular is called Kobe, and they work with the local communities to help them manage their fisheries, to provide data to come up with effective management strategies, and also train the local communities to dive and survey their own kelp forests. And so where you're seeing the greatest abundance of kelp forests, the greatest cover, is in the areas that are being managed by the fishing cooperatives. So it's not necessarily within a marine protected area, it's where the fisheries management is well established. Unfortunately, there are not fishing cooperatives everywhere. So these are very small pockets where you're seeing healthy kelp forests. But it's something that the community of conservationists and fisheries want to be able to expand, so that more of the kelp forest can be protected and restored, so that there's a healthy ecosystem for future generations. And one of the ways that they're collecting data on this ecosystem is through eDNA. So eDNA is a fantastic tool in terms of measuring biodiversity and presence. And so they monitor the fisheries presence through eDNA, where you can collect a water sample, filter that water sample, process it in a lab, and determine which species are present here. So using this method, they can check for the predator presence. So to see if there are sheepshead and wolf eels, and get a general biodiversity census of an area and monitor it through eDNA. So this is us collecting water samples under the water in the kelp forest. So you basically have this 2-liter bag that you fill with water, bring up to the surface, and then process. So that was quite a bit of information, but I just wanted to summarize it with emphasizing the importance of nature and food production and how they're inherently interconnected. So food security relies on ecosystem services, and in return, at the same time, it is one of the biggest reasons for the loss of ecosystem services. And that's because of our own mismanagement, but it doesn't have to be this way. And it's really important for us to incorporate systems in the future that are more sustainable. Now, this is a graph that shows food system dynamics, where you have plankton at the bottom, you have first level of predators here, you have more apex top tier predators here, and then humans at the top, and an energy flow that moves upwards. But in reality, the energy flow is moving in every which direction. So I added this here, this arrow, to show there's also an energy flow that moves downwards as decomposing organisms are feeding the plankton, and we have this amazing energy system where we all rely on one another in a myriad of ways. and that we need to respect this dynamic and ensure that we are protecting it and safeguarding it for the future. Because at the end of the day, all of us are reliant on one another. We rely on the plankton for our oxygen, because actually marine plants are providing more than 50% of the oxygen in our atmosphere. And the plankton rely on the top tier for nutrients and nutrient flow. And so there's this amazing energy flow that's happening both in ocean ecosystems, as I'm showing here, but also on land. And they're very dynamic. And it's important for us to recognize that resilient food systems are restorative, that if we have these extractive food systems, we know that they won't last for the future. It's important for us to have restorative food systems, such as what Cayman Island was doing with the sea turtle harvesting in a way that was actually giving back to the environment, or the way that the fishing cooperatives in Baja California are ensuring that their fishing systems are supporting healthy kelp forests and are protecting the kelp forest ecosystem. And there are just so many examples of what restorative fisheries and restorative food systems look like. And part of restoration is having a restorative food system is about incorporating concepts and of a circular economy. And circular economy means that all resources are recirculated into the system based on reuse and regeneration of materials and products. And right now, the global world is working towards our 17 sustainable development goals. And one of them is the number 14 is life below water, which is conserving and sustainably using the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. So this is one of the global goals, and is unfortunately the least funded out of the 17 sustainable development goals, but it also means that it has some of the most potential in terms of future work and funding. And food systems are also unfortunately very receiving low funding. I think that they get something like 3% of current funding, but I'd have to double check that stat. But these are two things that work hand in hand. The ocean supports our food systems, and our food systems in turn, our management of them has a huge potential in terms of conserving ocean ecosystems and ensuring that we have healthy oceans for the future. So with that, that's the summary of my presentation. I think I open it to questions at this point.
Thank you. Go back to that review. Thank you so much, Rosie. Yeah, so that's a lot to think about. That's an awful lot of information, a lot of new information for me, I have to say. So if you have any questions, could you please raise your hand? Raise your hand. Okay, I see Winnie right away raising her hand.
I can't find the little hand on my screen. I'm challenged today.
Okay.
But Rosie, there was just so perfect of explaining systems and how we're all interlocked. And then the outcome of your explanation for me is, how do I see what high principles are behind the regeneration and the success of this? And I named a few that I see right away, and I'm sure you operate on every day, but I just want to mention that to our participants, because the outcome of this is that we get information from experts like you, and then we take it out into the public. And presently, I'm just starting with the reading group of the Agriculture Working Group on pricing the priceless. And that's exactly what you're trying to do, is get people to realize that the oceans have not been paid for like we would pay for manufacturing something. And even the manufacturing at the cash register is not paying for all the natural environment that goes into making it. So I really appreciate this offering. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a thought?
I think Christine.
Christine.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much. I have learned a lot. I mean, I always learn when I listen to talks. You can always learn. But when I listen to you, I learned so much more. It was fascinating. And I really hope that you can share it more. Now you are you're doing photography and filmmaking, so your heart is already in sharing it more. What are your plans right now? What are you doing right now? Are you involved in certain research projects, or are you more focused on spreading the word? What are your priorities at work at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I've always loved interdisciplinary work. And so I started off doing a lot of field research and being more focused on marine biology and marine ecosystems and conservation. But at the end of the day, I love interdisciplinary work. So my work has been transitioning quite a bit over the years into more so storytelling and general sustainability, and focusing on blue economy and circular economies and the way that we can co-manage our systems. So I currently work with a company that does both impact storytelling through filmmaking, and we develop sustainability resources for different industries. But I do have some projects that I want to get off the ground. One of them is around sharing stories of sustainable fisheries management, because I think a lot of times we get a lot of criticism of fisheries, which is fine because we do need to critique our current systems, but we also need to show the world what sustainable fisheries look like, and that is possible. Because if we are only critiquing and we're bashing fisheries, when so many people around the world actually rely on fish as either their only source of protein or their primary source of protein, then we're not showing commitment to improving our systems. So that is a project that I really want to focus on, is sharing more about sustainable fisheries systems and what that looks like, so that it can provide resources and tools for other communities that are trying to manage better, and also help the individual figure out which fisheries to support and how to best use their voice.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. It's very exciting, and I wish you all the best with your plans, that they come to fruition. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Celine?
Oh, thank you. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question.
My mom, for context.
Let me take my hand down to, okay, there we go. Rosie, it's just, I always learn so much from your presentations each time. But I've had this question for like a little while now about how they did that on the boat, the halibut fishing. And I wonder if you can just share that slide again.
Sorry.
The slide of the halibut quotas, where they quantify the bycatch. I'm just so curious about how they actually do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. One moment. I'll just put that slide back up. Yeah, I didn't go into depth about the way that.
And for everybody else here, like, I usually don't get to ask a question because this is a really small presentation. Usually there's like lots of people and no question time anyway. Oh, good. Yes, exactly.
So the bycatch is monitored both by the fishing family as they're collecting. So what you're seeing here is like a clicker system, very basic but very effective, where as they're pulling up the fish, they're clicking in everything that's coming up. And then you have it, so lingcod, return, lingcod, kept. So you have the minus, the plus. So then they're tracking how many have been returned, thrown back. So that would be a lingcod that's undersized or something of that nature. So anything undersized has to be returned. You can only keep within like a certain length. Anything that's within acceptable length can be pulled up. So this is all tracking their bycatch. So they track it themselves. And then there's also two different forms of third-party analysis. There's a camera that's set up on the boat that they cannot tamper with, and it's monitored by a third-party source. And it's taking a photo of every fish that is coming up on the boat. And then that is monitored and audited externally. And then when they bring their catch on dock as well, there's another third-party company that comes and weighs and measures everything. So it's monitored in 3 different ways, both by the individuals who are fishing, and they upload all of this immediately to an online database and input it. So they're tracking it manually with the clickers, uploading it into an online database. Then they have the cameras that are third-party monitored, and then again, third-party monitored when they hit the dock. So this is ensuring consistency and ensuring that there is some visibility of what is occurring on the water. Because if it's all tracked by the fishermen themselves, then unfortunately maybe there would be dishonesty. So it's always good to have some kind of third-party monitoring. So that's how it's done in this way. Did that answer the question, or was
That's great. I still have another question because you and I have had some conversations about that. If you could keep the slide up again, because you've said that this you didn't find in your studies at UVic that this kind of fishery was highlighted in your conservation studies, and you chose them because they were unique. Or maybe I misunderstood, but that was my understanding. But my question about it, though, is that if it is unique, how does it fit into the grand scheme of things? Because this really does look like a management system that, as you said, there's 30 third parties involved. It seems like this would not be the only boat, and that this is a much larger fisheries management than simply this family has put into practice.
No, yeah, this family has not put the system into practice. This is a Canada ground fish management plan. This is how it's managed for all ground fisheries. I'm not sure if it's the same for the East Coast, but definitely for the West Coast. So this is like a federally managed management plan for ground fisheries. And when I refer to it as unique, it was uniquely developed, and now other countries around the world have been coming to Canada to study this ground fisheries management and to incorporate some of these practices either into their own ground fisheries or other forms of management, because this quota share is it's very revolutionary in terms of its design, because it's making different fisheries work alongside one another, and it's something that can be translated and implemented in other places, either with some variations to adapt to different fisheries in different places. But I'm just trying to remember all the components of the question. But the thing is, with fisheries management, not the same system is going to work in different communities. So for example, CCEF could never use this system because what they're working with is artisanal fisheries, completely different dynamic. Usually it's like one small boat with a tiny motor, and they're kind of catching whatever they can catch. So different forms of management may be more effective in those places. For example, seasonal closures, because it's easier to monitor that, where, okay, for like 6 months of the season, you don't fish in this certain spot, rather than having them count, because they don't have the technology in place. They can't have a camera on their boat. They're not necessarily going to be counting every fish that come up, establishing some kind of third party system on the dock. They don't have a dock that they go back to. They come back on the
And
beach.
CCEF, that was the fishery in the South Pacific, right? In
not a fishery.
Indonesia.
That's an
you had-
organization that works with local fishermen in terms of
Yeah.
capacity building.
But in Indonesia, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is just an example. So this can definitely be translated to other places, and I know that it already is being, because there have been other nations that have come to study the system, but it is still fairly unique in terms of it's like a new system, new technology. And when I was studying in Victoria, which is where this ground fisheries management was established, I never learned about this system. And that's why I'm really keen on sharing information about effective fisheries management, because I feel like I wasn't learning about this. And my university didn't offer fisheries management because they didn't believe in it. There were some profs who were very outspoken about the fact that fisheries management is not effective and we need to just put protected areas and no take zones. But that's a very privileged perspective to have, because a lot of the world does rely on fish for source of food, and humans have been eating fish ever since the beginning of time. So respecting that dynamic and acknowledging it and finding systems that work and can withstand the test of time is really important. Yes, Winona.
I I have so many questions, and it's because partly because my granddaughter is just getting ready to choose a university for your kind of work. But I was interested in the urchins taking over because when I lived in the Caribbean in Barbados, urchins had a season in which they could be harvested because they were considered a delicacy in the Caribbean. So I'm guessing that they weren't as prevalent, but also if it was in Indonesia or whatever, the indigenous cultures there did not eat them. Is that correct?
So these urchins are on the Pacific Northwest. So that's more so, that's Canada all the way down to US to Baja California.
Oh,
And in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of indigenous communities harvest urchins and like to eat them. And then there's also an urchin market for sushi. But unfortunately, urchins from urchin barrens are not they don't meet the standard for the market because they're starved. And so they don't have the right texture, the right consistency for the market. So there are some projects to harvest the starved urchins, feed them on land, and sell them to the market to try and tackle the issue of overabundance of urchins. But then you have to find a way to feed them as well, and so you have to grow some kind of plant product that they can eat, and then ensure that they meet the industry standard for the sushi market. But actually, in the Caribbean, it's a completely different problem with urchins. They actually don't have enough of them. So on the Pacific Northwest, we're like, oh, we have an overabundance of urchins. We don't know what to do. They're eating everything. But on the Caribbean side, they're actually we're losing urchins. They're dying out there, and the coral reefs are getting overrun by algae because the urchins are grazers. So they'll eat the algae, they clean the reef, and without enough urchins, then you get this smothering of coral reefs by algae. So that's probably why they have a season, because it's there aren't enough, so they're trying to limit the amount of harvest and to yeah, I'm not too familiar with the urchin management there, but I do know the Caribbean has the complete opposite issue.
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Christine?
I have a question. At the International Environment Forum, which is a Baha'i-inspired organization, collects case studies, both from Baha'i-inspired social action in the area of the environment, as well as scientific studies that show the interconnectedness between environmental and social issues. So my question is, have you written down these research projects in such an understandable way as you have presented right now? I mean, not as an abstract in a scientific paper, or would you be willing to write something for the International Environment Forum, for example, about the turtles or about the kelp and the sea urchins and the other predators that would also be so important, just to share all that knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. I had never heard of the IEF before, but Dawn was mentioning it to me before the call, and I'm definitely happy to be involved. So if you can reach out to me or send me any links and we can communicate, and I'd be happy to do something and be involved.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so much, really so much great information. It just surprised me to hear about, you said that marine plants provide 50% of the oxygen. That's
Yeah, I think some studies are showing more than 50%.
because, what we hear about the Amazon, right? We hear so much about the Amazon, but, and I have trouble with people trying to tell them about, oceans, how important they are, because I think a lot of people they don't really, as for some reason, don't seem to get the connection between oceans and our atmosphere and all that, how interconnected everything is. But that's an amazing statistic. I just was totally unaware of that.
Yeah, it is. It's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Neil?
Oh, sorry, hold on. I am thrilled because I think I know your mother and your grandparents.
Yes, and my cousin as well, Mehdi.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I think you are so articulate, as people have said. You are actually so good. Everything was so good. I I was born on a fishing town on the northeast, on the North Sea. And my grandfather was a fishing net manufacturer. And then I grew up in Aberdeen, which is a big fishing town in Scotland. But I'm scared of the sea. I'm very scared of the sea. So I prefer farming, land-based food production. But I think your talk, as other people have mentioned, is so informative and inspiring, and in the context of the future of the planet. So I'm so glad you were invited today. And I just want to express my heartfelt appreciation for your presentation.
Thank you, Neil. That's very kind. I think Winona, you have your hand up again.
And this may be off the mark, but for years, my Quaker friends were lobbying in Congress for the law of the seas. And when they passed on, I don't think it was still ratified by the United States. Does that affect your work at all? Because I think it has to do with the limit around the boundary, how nations can come into our limit, and how we can go out to other people's limit. So does that affect your work?
I'm not too familiar with, I'm not sure if I quite know the laws that you're referring to, but there was recently 88 nations have signed on, so that's nearly half of the world nations have signed this agreement called the BB&J. This just happened recently in New York City during Climate Week, and this is management for the deep sea and the open ocean as well, because there's a lot of challenges around management of the open ocean because this is international waters. You have to try and find ways for the different countries of the world to be in agreement of how it's going to be managed. But I don't know the specifics of that law, but it is providing the foundation and the framework to be able to make progress in terms of international waters and the way that we're managing both the deep sea, which is on a lot of people's radar right now because of the conversation of deep sea mining, as well as the open ocean in general. So there is still progress being made, but I don't know specifically about like the work that they were doing and if that's been picked up and carried on.
So it had to do with mining and
Okay.
your people's coastal boundaries. But
Okay.
yeah, but I'm not up to it, but I think it was a United Nations effort.
Yeah, it's still very very heavily disputed. There was a recent conference in Jamaica on trying to determine what is going to be done of deep sea and deep sea mining. I have a few friends who are very involved in that. I know less about it because it's not quite my area of expertise, but I do try and pay attention to the news as it comes. Gary, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, basically, I don't really know much, but I want to learn a lot more. But for me, fisheries is not the ocean. It's mostly in the farms and in the where we're growing fish in our lakes and things likewise. But you're mostly in the ocean. But I read something somewhere, and I'm just curious, that I have heard that things are not doing well in terms of producing enough fish for various populations, including here in Europe and in the North Sea and other regions of that, and even in the Netherlands, where I've used to live many years. These, are we hearing that actually the reduction of fish production is becoming rather a dominant thing in as our world is developing in the coming decades?
I very much believe that I'm of the mind that there's enough food for everyone and that it's partially about making our food systems more efficient and less wasteful. So right now there's a huge increase in aquaculture fisheries, and aquaculture is nearly to the point of matching wild catch and may even increase and overtake wild catch in terms of fisheries because some aquaculture techniques can improve the efficiency of our fisheries harvest and allow us to target certain species. There are forms of aquaculture that are very destructive. So not all aquaculture is made the same and equal, but there are ones that are very well managed and are very effective and are being are going to be a really important tool in terms of feeding a growing population of humans. But we do have a lot of fisheries methods that are extremely wasteful and also destroy the environment of the fisheries that we're targeting. So as I was mentioning with trawling. So if we're able to adjust or eliminate these kind of practices, so there's a company in Canada that's working on making a smart trawl that instead of dragging on the seafloor, it hovers somewhere above and will startle species so that at least it's not dragging on the seafloor. So that's one improvement. You're not tearing up the whole ecosystem. So incorporating practices that are going to be less destructive is going to ensure that we're going to have more fish for the future, and then creating management systems that reduce the amount of waste as well. Because I genuinely think like we have enough food for the world, but a lot of the methods that we're currently using are A, destructive, B, they overfish. So if we're able to incorporate improvements into those aspects of the industry, then we're going to have enough for our growing population, and the population of humans is eventually going to peak. And then we won't have to be finding ways to harvest more and more. We'll just have to make sure that we can sustain ourselves.
Rosie, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see the chat.
Yeah, I just keep looking at the chat. It's Mark Griffins asks, there are some no fish zones highlighted in the news that help adjacent fishing areas thrive. Do these work?
Yes, no fish zones and no take zones can be very effective. And there are certain types of ecosystems that I definitely advocate for no fish and no take. I don't think no fish and no take should be the status quo all the time, because then it's important to recognize humans as an ecosystem driver and that we are able to take and harvest sustainably. And I think having a language where we're like, the only way that an ecosystem can be sustainable is if humans are not interacting with it is kind of destructive, because I think humans should be interacting in a sustainable manner. But no fish and no take are very effective management measures and should be, especially for areas that are nursery grounds or particular a cultural importance. Like there's a region up north that's absolutely no entry reserve because it's an area where orcas go and rub on the beaches, so to not disturb that area. Or for nursery grounds, for spawning grounds, for example, groupers have a spawning season, so it doesn't have to be always year round. It can also be like a seasonal no take, or no takes where there can be, yeah, or if it's like an area of acute biodiversity that we're trying to protect. And because you do get a lot of overflow when you protect an area and the fish are able to proliferate there, then you get overflow in surrounding areas and adjacent areas, which is what you're probably reading about. So these can be extremely effective, and we definitely need a certain percentage of no take reserves. Yeah, that was a little bit roundabout answer, but I hope it I hope it helped.
Thanks.
I see Neil's hand up again.
Yeah, so what I really liked about your presentation is this systems perspective. And I think, to echo what Winnie was talking about, the ideas in the Baha'i revelation, these are ideas that Baha'u'llah has highlighted. You know, but the great thing about revelation, it means it reveals something that was concealed. And I think the fact that your whole worldview is taking this ecosystemic approach to the world. This is where the world obviously has to go. But when countries look at the oceans or the land as, you know, national rights, 200-mile, you know, jurisdiction, sovereignty, these are the kind of concepts that are very destructive. And so everything becomes transactional. You know, we have to negotiate this and that. But I think what was so refreshing, one of the very refreshing aspects of your talk, was how it was so luminous in terms of looking at everything from the standpoint of the ecosystem, whether the oceans, in this case, the oceans themselves. And you articulated it very, very wisely in terms of, you know, where we're at and the different things. So I just wanted to commend that. That's where there's this inter sort of overlap between the, you know, the ideas contained, the concepts contained in the Baha'i revelation, and as they're being implemented through the guidance of the Universal House of Justice. Universal House of Justice is fully aware of the state of the oceans, but you know, it's part of this new one world kind of one ocean perspective. And I really was so happy that your whole presentation kind of reflected that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really important to elevate our conversations in the way that we talk about our interactions as well, and to not always focus on the negative. We have to critique what is happening and to find improvements to the systems, but we also need to talk about how humans can be positive ecosystem drivers, because at the end, that's what the writings ask of us as well. Like, we should be always improving the environment around us. That's either within our communities, with other people. It's also the way that we steward. We act as stewards for the natural environment as well, that to treat the world around us with respect should be at the core of all of our interactions. And it's really important to champion that and to also show what that looks like, so that people can begin to imagine what a better world looks like. Because if we're only showing them the negative and critiquing, then we aren't imagining, and we're limiting our minds in terms of imagining what a genuine, sustainable future looks like. And spiritually, we need that. We need to see what a positive world looks like. Yes, Christine.
I have a question about fish farming. I know, like, the salmon farming is extremely bad in many ways, because it has to happen in the ocean, and then first of all, it's cruel to the animals. They all get diseases, and they are close together, and they are having a horrible life because they are all sick. They use bad chemicals in the netting so that the netting is doesn't deteriorate in the ocean water, and then all the diseases of the animals go into the wild population. So it's an environmental problem, plus all their waste is a problem for the environment. So and then when humans eat it, it's not good for their health. If I happen to eat a farmed salmon, and salmon I usually tolerate really well, and I you know, my health is fine with salmon. But when I eat a farm-raised salmon, I cannot sleep a whole night. And I don't think it's healthy for humans either, even those who are not that sensitive as I am. So my question is, because you raised the question of these farm-raised fish, which fish can you recommend to eat that are farm-raised? And which do you think, are there others besides salmon that we should not eat?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because like I was saying, not all aquaculture is the same and equal. There are some that are done well, and there are some that are not done well. And unfortunately, the Atlantic salmon aquaculture systems in Canada are very destructive, because like you were saying, they're in high concentration. They put them at river mouths, so it jeopardizes the health of the local salmon population. And instead, if we were investing a lot into our local salmon and the natural life cycle that already occurs on this coast, because we do have salmon, instead of bringing in an invasive species, which is the Atlantic salmon, and farming it in Pacific waters, we would have a much better ecosystem all around, because this ecosystem on the West Coast already relies on the Pacific salmon. They are native. They are extremely nutritious. We have 5 different species. We have plentiful amounts of salmon. We could be investing into preserving our ecosystem, so that we have like a very strong local salmon fisheries. But unfortunately, it's been jeopardized for the sake of Atlantic. So that's very unfortunate, not an effective form of aquaculture. A lot of challenges with that. There are, however, some really effective aquaculture, more so open ocean as well. There's some that are open ocean, so then you have a lot of nutrient flow instead of concentrating them in river mouths. So then you have more nutrient flow, more nutrient influx, not as much of an impact on like a local ecosystem that's already existing. So open ocean ones can be quite effective. There are a few companies that I came across. I would have to send them in a follow-up email though, because there are some companies that are doing some really good aquaculture techniques. One that I do personally avoid is shrimp and shrimp farming. Unfortunately, shrimp it's such a fantastic fish, but a lot of shrimp farms destroy mangroves. Like they'll destroy mangrove ecosystems in order to put shrimp farms in place. And unfortunately, even wild caught shrimp has some of the highest concentration of bycatch of any fisheries. So that is another one that I personally avoid. But in terms of providing a list of some that are good, I'm going to have to look that up and send it in a follow-up. But there are even some salmon aquaculture farming there is some that's occurring in Florida. I have a friend that's told me about it, and there have been some efforts here as well to do closed circuit ones on land. And closed circuit means that it's not disrupting the local ecosystem at all in any way, because it's not pumping nutrients back into the local ecosystem. So there were some really great projects that were doing some closed circuit salmon farming here. But I'm gonna have to look a little bit more in depth.
Thank you.
Yes, Neil.
Tilapia is the one that we have the only aquaculture farm that's also growing lettuce. It's a closed system where they're using the excrement from the tilapia to grow lettuce. We have the only organic one in Canada right next to us, just like 15 kilometers away. But I think, and also when we were in Africa, tilapia was the fish that seems very suitable for land-based aquaculture.
Yeah, tilapia is a very good one. And what you're describing is aquaponics, which is super effective.
Oh, sorry, aquaponics, yeah.
No, it's great. Yeah, aquaponics is where you take it a step further. So you have aquaculture where you're just growing marine species fish, and then you have aquaponics where it's contributing to growing land plants as well, where you use like the nutrients. And that's an example of like a closed circle system, and also an example of something that's circular. Like you could describe that as circular economy, because everything is contributing to one another, and it's this extremely effective form of agriculture. So aquaponics is great. I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yes, that the aquaponics is an interesting whole issue. Recently, we had someone from Desert Rose Baha'i Institute to speak, and they're doing a lot of work there and also encouraging the aquaponics. Even in Arizona, it's a very popular thing, this backyard aquaponics, having people have little pools in their backyards where they can grow vegetables using that whole system.
I love that. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, even in Arizona, it's interesting. It's desert there, but it's much more efficient way of actually growing a lot of things,
Yeah,
vegetables and things, than trying to grow it in the ground, they've found. So
unfortunately, I have to wrap up because I'm actually going to be hopping in the ocean with some of my friends. We're gonna go do a dive. So I do have to go get ready.
yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending the time here with us today. Very enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm grateful
Yeah.
to have invited. It was such a joy, and I love the questions, and I love like hearing how excited everyone is to hear about this. Because yeah, it's really great feedback for me, because it makes me realize that this is information that needs to be shared a lot more widely. And
And it will be available on our YouTube channel for people. Lots of people go there. You know, this is kind of a small representation. We have about 220 some people on our list, so they'll get this information. And
that's fantastic.
thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.